Welcome back to the Block Fuel podcast. Today we are joined by David Schwed, who is currently the COO over at Halborn, who has spent many years over at BNY Mellon, a lot of different areas as well, talking about security. And so we are super excited to have you on the show. Welcome to the Block Fuel podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So to kick things off, I know you're currently over at Halborn, which is working on security from a very high level, but you've spoken a lot. I actually saw you over at the Benzinga conference, just talking about this major paradigm shift that we're seeing in finance, really around infrastructure, right? And I think it's one of these things we keep hearing about these institutions that keep coming, and we're finally starting to see it now, the people that are in the space. But for those that aren't very familiar with some of the banks and institutions coming in, would you mind just going very high level, anything that's public information, of course? And what does that really mean, like this enterprise grade security? And why do you feel like a lot of Web3 companies are not ready per se for this?
Yeah, absolutely. It's no fault to any projects, particularly in Web3. It's a matter of being around from a maturity perspective to have the ability over years, whether it's following certain frameworks, for example, this NIST cybersecurity framework, or following something from COVID, from ISACA, or just pick your random framework and implement it. What we're seeing in Web3 is, although the technology has been around for going on at this point, 12, 13 years, depending on if you're talking about Bitcoin, Ethereum, et cetera, there's still this level of immaturity in the sense of there's no frameworks. There's no consensus when it comes to, are we going with HSMs? Are we going with MPCs? If we are going with MPCs, which particular protocol? MPC is really just a generic term, and there's different implementations of MPC. So you're having this new technology, and you're having individuals who are in the ecosystem who don't necessarily bring with them this type of expertise and enterprise level experience of building the resiliency that we see today in banks. And they're building with the cutting edge technology in Web3. But if you look at a typical enterprise, they're going to have teams of hundreds of people, if not into the thousands, to support their organization. Now, again, that's obviously due to the scale of the organization, but you're talking about domain level expertise in HSMs or cryptographers, or just network security experts, or people that are specifically focused on application security. So they could have just teams and teams of people that are just focused on their particular domain expertise. But if you look at a startup in the Web3 space, typically you'll see maybe one or two different security folks. There's always that jack of all trades, master of none in some respect. So you'll have individuals who have a domain expertise in maybe one area and a little bit in the other area. So I think that's the dichotomy that we're seeing today.
And just to piggyback off that real quick, I think I've seen Citi in the news, JPMorgan, they've been pretty controversial where they weren't in and then they were, and we're seeing a lot of these banks that are coming in. So could you speak like very high level in terms of what they're doing? Is that mostly on the architecture side of things? And are these institutions, are they going about it the right way, do you feel?
I do. I think there's two distinctions to make. One is digital assets as an asset class. And then I think there's also digital ledger technology as plumbing, as operational efficiencies. So I think it's really important to separate those two in your mind. And if you look on LinkedIn, or if you look what's publicly available, you'll see that there are people that are DLT Center of Excellence that are specifically focused on digital ledger technology that isn't necessarily focused on the price of Ethereum or Bitcoin or any of the other tokens. And then you have people that are focused on the financial aspect of digital assets and how can we hedge, or how can there arbitrage between different exchanges, et cetera, and build quant strategies around profiting off of the asset class. And if you look at like the biggest use cases right now that I think is really what the banks are adopting is taking existing financial products or existing processes that we see in the financial markets and operationalizing it using digital ledger technology. So the biggest use case that everyone talks about is obviously real world assets and the tokenization. But the other thing that doesn't get as much is really like cross-border payments, for example. If you look at the ability from the US to be able to send payments in a native asset in another country, the traditional financial markets to do that, you have correspondent banks and respondent banks and beneficiary banks. And it could take days in order to get a payment sent. If you're using payment rails on crypto, you're able to do that instantaneously and be able to swap natively in your native country into your particular stablecoin and into your enabled fiat. So again, you're not introducing this new tokenized strategy, or you're not tokenizing your world asset. You're taking an existing thing that we do today in financial services, and how can we do it quicker, better, faster, removing risk using digital ledger technology. So I think it's really important to separate those two.
Mhm. So in some ways, do you see, I know that JP Morgan's largest bank in the US painted as the enemy, the bad guy to a lot of decentralized finance and Web3 movement. Do you see the Onyx blockchain project that JP Morgan's doing as maybe a good thing, and people need to realize that on the DeFi side is, hey, this is probably our best way that this is going to get approved if JP Morgan does a really good one that shows like how the risk can be mitigated. And then if you put that in front of Congress, they're going to be able to have a really polished egg that they can show and say, hey, distributed leverage technology is not that bad. We can control it. It's very traceable, et cetera. Love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point of the different factions of crypto. You have the libertarians, the disintermediates, and let's revolutionize the financial system. And while it's a novel idea and a novel task, it's not feasible, right? That's just not the way the world works. And I think that for the people that are the true OG believers in crypto, I think they have to take a more pragmatic approach as to, we want to get this in the hands of the billions of people across the world. It has to be done in slow, methodical rollout, which absolutely 100% includes adoption by banks and also includes regulatory approval. At the end of the day, we're still not functioning our lives buying and selling things in Bitcoin and ETH, no matter how many times people want to do that. There has to be these all forwards into fiat. And those all forwards into fiat are controlled by the banks, and there's still regulatory approvals. You need money transmitter licenses or bit licenses, or you have to be a bank or a truck. There's still these safeguards. So I think the people that really truly believe in this and want DeFi to really take hold have to understand that there has to work together with the banks, and we have to work together to get that regulatory approval.
Taking that a step further, you said last week we just introduced ourselves and caught up with you, but you said something really interesting going off this decentralized movement of the OGs of crypto. They still rely on it. You mentioned like AWS, Google Cloud, right? And then even things like Helium Network are still reliant on Verizon. So the further you go up the channels, you realize that the people sitting in basements just degenning into different coins, like ultimately the buck does stop with the government and some of these major institutions, right? If you could just continue that thought a little bit further.
Yeah, absolutely. It's and not to talk down on the decentralized folks, but there's always centralized choke points in every single piece of infrastructure. It's just a full understanding of the tech stack and understanding how the world works to understand that there is at some point going to be centralization in this decentralized world. And you can never achieve pure decentralization. If you look at where is, again, I don't know a percentage, but I would gather it's probably close to 90% of the infrastructure right now is going to be found in either Google Cloud, Azure, or AWS, or Alibaba, or one of those other cloud providers. And then if you look at the fact that we have to transmit data from node A to node B, and guess what? That's going to go over a telecommunications provider. So unless degens are going to start digging up the street and laying their own fiber and start lighting their own fiber pair and creating a whole decentralized telecommunications network, we're still relying on the fiber and the copper that's put in the street by the telecommunications providers. And they're the ones that control the packets. So there is still these centralized choke points that are out there. So that's also, incredibly relevant from a security perspective, but also just we have to play nice with the existing infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a good point of playing nice. So you really need, I think there's really the thought and the speech around a lot of the crypto anarchy needs to mature in the sense of, okay, like this is a reality. Like you're going to have to use some sort of internet, whether it's like using fiber, you can use cellular, but it's going through some large company. Talk big about what you imagine it to be, but here's the reality of what you're actually going to do. And we appreciate having people like yourself that are like, look, like this is what you're going to be dealing with. So how can we work with this in the best manner possible?
100%. If there was legislation passed tomorrow that said it's illegal to host node providers, guess what? Azure, AWS, do you really think that's a huge portion of their business today? And within seconds, they're going to be kicked off their cloud providers. And it's not worth it from a pure economical perspective to go against legislation. Very easy to create these different choke points from a legislative standpoint. So when I'm on crypto Twitter, crypto X, whatever we're calling it now, and you're seeing all these people just launching tirades against against the senators and the congressmen, like that's not the way we should be working this through. We shouldn't go on the offensive and attack. There's no other industry that I see that is as vocal and vehemently just launching these tirades against, public officials on Twitter. That's not how you get things done. If you want to push through legislation, do it the way that everybody else does. Call your local congressman and join shade groups and really try to get your point across from a pragmatic, logical perspective instead of just screaming across Twitter.
We were just talking with the Texas Blockchain Foundation last week, I think it was, and he was voicing that same opinion of you need to sit at the table with them and actually have these conversations because the people in DC, we look at them as these big bad wolves, but in reality, there are some good players out there that understand the value of this technology. And ultimately, we do need to sit down with them. And because like you said, like they could turn off if they said this is illegal within a matter of a week or so. The normies out there that aren't like diehard crypto folks, would probably get scared off and wouldn't be involved. And that kills off a lot of the ecosystem. The next kind of conversation I'd want to have is somewhat in that same ballpark around like CBDCs. And he said something very interesting where you actually don't think necessarily it will be used from like Avi sending money to Jody necessarily with CBDCs, or at least stage one of that would be more of banks. So do you think at some point, given the nature of moving up and the Verizons of the world or all these the companies that have to be involved, the big banks, et cetera, like if the government says, hey, we want to introduce CBDCs, can they shut off all these other protocols effectively? And how do you see CBDCs integrating into society?
Yeah. And so first question, how do I see CBDC? Again, it's the digital currency. So it's right now, it'll be interbank, the central bank settling or sending funds to the large banks or bank to bank payments. I don't think we're at a point from a user experience perspective where people feel comfortable holding digital wallets. And that just comes down to just comfortableness with the technology, understanding how to back up. There's still this security risk with key signed transactions, and I lose access to my funds and I can't get it back due to the immutability. And I think that's the challenge we need to solve. So I'm not advocating for reversibility per se within transactions. If I give somebody a $20, I should not have the ability to pull that $20 back out of their hands. But if I give somebody $20 and they fail to honor the agreement and I go to court and there's some way to take that money, like there is in the traditional world, I think that those types of safeguards and procedural processes need to be put in place. So I think that's more down the line is how do we actually effectuate these things digitally? I think just step one is how can we get comfortable around digital currency between back to banks? Because again, even custody today, many large banks are still working through their custody solution. So either they've launched or the very early stages. So I think until that has fully solved, I don't think we're going to see large scale rollout of CBDC. That's why I think it's going to be more the interbank.
And do you think, thinking of how crazy the world has gotten, it feels like over the past year or two, even more so than ever, it feels like we're coming into this scary moment where the US, you see all these companies like vocally coming against us. There is a real threat of like an EMP potentially down the road. And do any of the protocols protect against something like that? Or is there a world where if an EMP, God forbid, happens, does all of commerce stop then? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, I think that the answer is larger than crypto. I think it's the same thing when people talk about quantum computing. Are we concerned in crypto about quantum computing? And the answer is yes, but there's so many other things that would get affected by it as well. So it's not a crypto specific problem that crypto needs to solve. We need to be aware of the different advances in quantum computing and the same thing with the threats that you're talking about on your end. But whether or not you have paper money or whether or not you remember your seed phrase or have the ability to have things that are written down on paper, there always backup of your digital money on paper form. I don't necessarily think that's per se a risk, but definitely like the ability to send and receive payments is definitely a concern. But again, it's not limited to crypto per se.
I think it's a good point of if you had access to a quantum computer and you were a nefarious actor, like you're Lex Luthor, would you rather hack into Bitcoin's code and suddenly have a lot of Bitcoin that you can't off ramp anywhere immediately? Or would you rather hack the nuclear football and have access to a full arsenal of nukes? You're probably going to choose the latter. And there's a lot of other things in the world that are like handled by computers that could be hacked by a quantum computer before you try to hack Bitcoin itself.
The biggest issue right now is US included, all the nation states are holding on to troves of encrypted data. So they have the last 30, 40, 50 years of all of our encrypted data, and they're just waiting for the ability to decrypt it and just look at all of our secrets. And we're doing the same for other nations too. So that's probably one of the biggest concerns right now is we can't go back and re-encrypt data that's already in someone's hands. It's just a matter of time before the ability for them to decrypt all of this data becomes readily available.
Can you touch on just recently in the news? We touched on high level last week, but I think this was only like 3 days ago, actually, with Ledger. So Ledger was in the news most recently. They got hacked. Could you just share high level? I'm a headline reader, so I just read the headline. But for those that don't feel like digging into this a little bit further, could you give your take on what happened?
Yeah, sure. Everybody knows the Ledger, arguably the best hardware wallet that's out there at the moment.
Still have mine in a wrapper, by the way, from 4 or 5 years ago.
Listen, just about to go on a little tirade yelling at them in a couple of seconds. I still use them and I have them, and it's still one of the go-to wallets that I recommend. There's a few other that I like as well. That's one of the main ones that I recommend. And what the vulnerability wasn't within the Ledger itself. So there's nobody at risk of now I need to start rotating my funds and moving them off of the Ledger onto other devices. What happens is when you have the secure devices, but now you need to interact with it, they have to build this interoperability layer in order to interact with different applications. So that's where this particular vulnerability came in. And they have this wallet connect. So that way, when you go to a DApp like a Uniswap or whoever, and you click on, I want to connect my Ledger wallet, it loads up code in order to connect the application over to your Ledger. So that way you can sign transactions that are sent over from that particular DApp. And in this wallet kit, there was malicious code put in for a drainer. That way you would grant access just like you normally would. So it's not like the user is tricked into doing something. They're communicating with the correct app, the actual URL, have the ledger in, they're clicking everything like they did 2 weeks ago. If they clicked it during this vulnerability period, they would have been given token approval access to a particular address in order to drain funds. And what happened was there was, again, this is per Ledger, a former employee of Ledger was phished. That person had credentials to basically the package library that have this particular package. So they were able to update the package and insert malicious code via this phished employee's credentials.
So do you think with that, I saw someone's response on Twitter was just like, guys, this is ridiculous. If one former employee can take down like every meaningful DeFi app just because they still have that credentials, then this is our entire industry is just like hanging by a single toothpick and it can all be a house of cards. Do you see processes around DevOps and mobile device management and all employees as being like the crux of the problems we were speaking at the very beginning of where the industry needs to mature?
This goes back exactly to maturity. So number one, first issue is you have foreign employees whose rights were not rescinded when they left the organization. I have never worked at a super large organization where my access was cut immediately the last day of my employment within that organization. That's number one. Number two, to your point, one individual having the access, the ability to go in and update a package library is insane. I never worked in an organization that doesn't have at least 5, 6, 7, 8 procedural steps in order to go through to gain access to a production code base in order to insert code. That's number two. Number three, ongoing monitoring. So another organization was the one that picked up this particular vulnerability. And it wasn't, listen, I give kudos to that organization. It's great that they found it and alerted them, but this isn't something that Ledger themselves should not have been monitoring their own code base, identified a change in code, and then saying, hey, we don't have a reconciled change management ticket to say that we updated the code base, and then immediately pull the library. That's a circuit breaker that you can programmatically build in. If I'm the CISO over there, if code changes, no ticket that matches up with the code change, then I'm immediately pulling the library. I can programmatically build that. And it isn't something that is like, oh my God, you're the most intelligent person in the world. These are the mature controls and processes that we see in large organizations that are put in. And the way these things are typically put in is not that you have this like unicorn of a CISO, right? You don't have to go out and find the most brilliant CISO in the world. What you have is you have multiple organizations that all have different eyes. So a typical structure within a large organization, especially a bank, is you have your technology function that arguably is thinking about things like this because they're building it. Then you have your information security, that's second set of eyes that's looking at it. Then you have your technology risk management function. So you have your line one risk, which is your risk folks that are embedded within the technology folks and working with them. And you have a completely separate function called line two risk that is now challenging that whole construct that I just talked about, the line one risk. Are you thinking about this? Are you thinking about this? And you have your internal audit function that's looking at the control efficiencies. And then if you're a regulated entity, then you have banking examiners, the SEC and whoever, internal auditing in. So it's not that there's one person is the most brilliant, sturdy person in the world, which is a lot of projects are looking for that unicorn. It's just you're crowdsourcing really great control ideas from really mature technology risk management folks. So that control that I just laid out there, again, is something that a large organization is already doing because it's just BAU for them. And the other piece is this particular kit was pulling live code every time they launched it. Now that's great. And I understand why they did it from an efficiency perspective. This is great. I can ensure that everybody's using my code is using the latest set of code base because every time it launches, it just pulls down new code. That's great. That's a supply chain risk. And also speaks to the level of immaturity and some of the dApps for not pushing back on Ledger and saying, hey, listen, I have no problem connecting to your wallet, but I'm not loading live code every single time I launch. I can now put my users at risk. So I think there's this challenge that needs to happen. And again, immaturity.
We talked about some of the banks. This was back, I think, in November where Visa chose Solana to do some of the settlements. Would love to touch on that a little bit. I know you have a background in communications. This is probably a year ago now that I interviewed Anatoly over at Solana. But it was fascinating because the reason we got Anatoly on, I was actually half joking that the phone's never going to make it. They're going to compete with Apple and Google. Their PR team actually reached out to me and we were able to get him on to clear the air. And I walked out of there with a much better understanding of why they're building it. They want to have a Web3 focused phone out the gates. But Visa is a massive player, one of the biggest payment in the world for sure. Them choosing Solana is a big sign of companies no longer just the Nikes of the world doing NFTs or Starbucks doing NFTs. Can you dive a little bit further about what this means and what Visa is actually going to be doing with Solana? And then number two, do you see other companies coming into this space in the payments? So do you see a lot of the payment companies move in this direction as well?
Yeah, whether or not they choose Solana or some other layer one, you have to look at why. Not that Solana is not a great layer one, but there are fundamental challenges with Ethereum, which is why we have all of these layer twos that are now popping up. But with every layer two, you're now introducing centralization risk. So you're going to have smaller set of validators and more controls from a code base perspective. And then you have finality issues. I forgot which one last week. One of them went down for a couple hours and there was no confirmation of transactions on the mainnet. So you do have a scalability problem with Ethereum that is being solved with some layer twos and some protocols changes. Solana does have much faster transactions per second. So Solana is definitely a choice. If you're just looking for payment and settlement and clearing and low fees, Solana is obviously one of the other ones that you're going to be focusing on. So I think as we look at the particular use case of digital ledger technology, other layer ones there's no clear winner because there's no clear use case. If you're just doing, say, NFTs, maybe Polygon. If you're just doing payments, maybe it's Solana. If you're looking for something with maybe more validators worldwide, maybe you're going to go from a decentralization perspective and speed isn't necessarily an issue. Maybe that's where you're going to look for putting something on Ethereum mainnet. The biggest challenge obviously is bridges, is now having all of these separate networks, if you will, and bringing back to the telecommunications. It's really the same thing if you think about it. You have Verizon building their network, you have Quest building their network, you have other telecommunication providers over in Europe or Asia or Africa or Australia building their networks. And there has to be a way for traffic from one area of the world to make it to the other. And it's the same thing with crypto. Think of Solana as one country, think of Ethereum as another country, and has to be a way to get that traffic. Bridges is one attempt at solving that problem. There are layer zeros, which is really fundamentally the same thing in some respect. So I think ultimately, whether it's 3 or 5 years from now, I think you'll see this kind of open network built into the protocols themselves that have the ability natively to send assets between each other, as opposed to using these third-party bridges, just like telecommunications. I can ping a server. I'm sitting in the US and I can ping a server over in Japan and I can cross 7 different carriers and they all just agree to carry that packet across. And there's chargebacks for the transmission of data for transport purposes, but that was all built in via worldwide acceptance of protocols. And I think that's what we need in order to solve this problem.
A little bit different topic. I think from your seat, it's super interesting on the specific area of just users of crypto. We see a lot of, say, the Elizabeth Warren political bill that was introduced around restricting or regulating crypto through their eyes. And then even prior to that, the start of the war on Israel and Palestine around terrorist financing. From your experience, and take it the direction that you want to take it with, how have you seen maybe misconceptions in the news around terrorist financing, how it's been handled? I saw Chainalysis came out with a really good rebuttal report to the Washington Post or another big media publication saying, look, all your data on the 100 million that was sent to Hamas is wrong. It was probably a much, much smaller number. Things are very traceable via blockchain technology. And on the other side of the world, you also see a lot with Lazarus Group in North Korea, an ability to fund their nuclear program through a lot of their on-chain hacks.
Yeah, I think from a conception standpoint, I think there's this separating bad actors from the vehicles in which they effectuate their means. Getting rid of crypto does not get rid of terrorists. Getting rid of crypto does not get rid of North Korea Lazarus Group or funding their missile programs. So I think that's what we have to understand is this might just be one of the many ways in which they're effectuating their bad deeds or using it for payment rails. There's other ways that they're doing it too. It's just getting some of the news just because for whatever reason, there's people in Congress that are just vehemently opposed to crypto. And I understand why. There's, again, the difference between an asset class versus using digital ledger technology to create better operational plumbing. And I think Congress is scared of the former, which is the asset class in and of itself. Their job is to protect the American people. And when they see individuals lose tons of money and scams and whatever, their immediate gut reaction is to protect. And they protect within, but they also don't understand. So I think that's also the challenge that I want to push back on Congress is instead of just legislating because you're afraid of it, try to really understand this technology because it's not going away. We don't live in a world where the US can just decide, I don't want to do this. Jobs are already going overseas. It's already being adopted in other jurisdictions. You have MiCA, you have MIS out of Singapore, you have obviously in Dubai, Hong Kong. There are so many crypto friendly jurisdictions that are out there. So I think Congress is taking the approach of, let me slow down or let me demonize it or let it just give it a bad reputation and it will go away, which it won't. So I think that's like my broad strokes. I do think from a regulatory perspective, I do think we're going to see clarity in 2024. It may come from legislation. It may come from litigation. I think, unfortunately, it may come from litigation, which in some respects, it's not the path that I think many would have chosen, but I think is the path that actually gives a little bit of finality, because if the courts are going to come down and give some judgments and give some final precedents in certain areas, it's in theory a little bit more protected than someone launching legislation and then having the lawsuits after the fact to then challenge it. So if we're jumping right to the courts to then force the legislation, again, not the path that I would have chosen. But if we end up getting some ETFs out of it from Grayscale or BlackRock or somebody else, I'll take it. So that's my broad strokes on that.
I was actually leading perfectly into my next question around the ETFs. Do you think that helps push some of the additional legislation that's being talked about? Because it is an election year coming up. Do you see this ETF kind of spearheading some additional legislation before the election?
There are definitely pockets in the United States that are begging and screaming for crypto to get legitimacy. But there's other areas of the country that either A, just don't give a shit, frankly, and B, are opposed to it because they're buying into the terrorist financing thesis. And they're also concerned around government overreach. And now if we move to digital currency, the government's going to be tracking all my spending, that type of mentality. But I don't think there's this big push from constituents to force their congressmen to adopt these bills. So I think what we're looking for is congressmen that are really forward thinking, or congresswomen that are very forward thinking, to say that they understand that this is coming and this is going to create new markets and new jobs and new opportunities for people. And if we don't, we're going to be left behind. So I think it's going to take a little bit of that to build up the people to really fully understand it. So a lot of it comes down to education. So I don't think there's a big push, honestly, my gut feeling from Congress to push this through, because again, frankly, they don't necessarily fully understand it. And I guess they feel also reputationally, this gets tied to terrorist financing, or it gets tied to an 80-year-old grandmother somewhere losing her life savings, then they don't want their name associated with a bill that pushes forward.
Yeah, it's interesting because I talked a while back to this. They were talking about potentially using CBDCs for like welfare programs so they could control somewhat of the spending. They didn't want them to go just buy a bunch of alcohol or lottery tickets, but like almost like the new version of food stamps. Do you think that's a reality in the next couple of years?
I don't think so, because I think from an optics perspective, I don't think that's what you'd want to launch with, because then that's going to double down on this is going to be used to control people and control their spending. So I honestly don't think that's probably where it's going to come from. I think, again, it's going to start with the bank to bank. So that way, if there is a screw up, it doesn't have to be public. And two, the bank could fix it among themselves. If there's digital currency and people all of a sudden just their wallets get hacked and they lose all their money, is the government going to now turn around and make everybody whole? So I think it's going to be a little while before it gets into our hands. Because again, even forget that side of it, the user experience. And anybody that I know that's not super technical doesn't really have a good feeling or good time using crypto. They're still confused. They get yelled at when they don't use a ledger or self-custody. And then they get yelled at when they're creating it on an exchange or using a custodial wallet. Like, yeah, everybody yelling at everybody, what's the right way to do it? Not your keys, not your crypto. But then people don't really know how to hold onto their keys, and they're losing their seed phrases and losing their money, or getting hacked because they wrote it down on a notepad someplace. So I think until that problem gets solved, I don't think we're going to see a big push for CBDC in the hands of consumers.
It goes in and replaces, or more competitive with, Ripple's use case. I don't know like too deeply on what Ripple's got going on, but interbank settlement was one of the big things that they've been pushing. And wholesale payments between banks seems like that could be wiping them out.
Well, it's effectively the same thing, except that Ripple is in theory like tokenized some things that's indicative of the deposits in the banks. And this is just you're removing the tokenization aspect of it, and they're actually worth $1 or they're worth whatever it's worth. So it's really the same construct. It's just from the federal government, and then you're removing the tokenization aspect of it. And it's just the coin itself is the asset.
We haven't touched on Halborn at all, but would love to just hear, you don't need to pitch us on Halborn by any means, but just curious, what are you guys doing from a high level, and what are the biggest threats that you're seeing thematically over the past 6 months, and what do you guys see in the future here?
Yeah, I think if you look at Halborn, if I had to say, here are the two things that we do, it's advisory work and assurance work. So we'll work with organizations that have built something, and we'll look at different components of it and give an assessment report of the different vulnerabilities, whether it's a smart contract audit/assessment. I could probably spend an hour arguing against the use of the word audit and say we should be using assessment as a community, but I'll use the word audit for this podcast. So a smart contract audit, we'll do a pen test. But then we'll work with other organizations like large banks from an advisory perspective of how should we be building custody? What does our interoperability with our traditional custody infrastructure look like? If we're thinking about things like cross-border payments, what are some of the risks that we should be thinking about? Doing things like insider threat exercises, which is really interesting because if you think about it, no matter how large an organization is, there's going to be X people that can collude and work together in order to do something bad, whether it's bring down infrastructure or whether it's to gain access to certain information like key material. There's going to be an X number of people that can work together to do that.
And specifically on, let's say someone brand new to his career wants to work at Halborn or generally wants to work in security. What would you suggest like now is a good way for them to get started? Would you suggest going down the dev route or more focused on security itself and any ways to get started and then get close to where you are?
I do have a little bit of a background in academia, and I'll give you the same pitch that I talk to students about is don't jump into security. You don't have to become a developer because that's the other piece too. It's people want to get into security, but I'm not a developer. But I said, that's something separate, but don't jump into security. Understand the underlying technology first really well, because you can't secure something that you don't know how it works. And like the easiest example that I would give students is you may know I need a firewall. Why? Because a firewall blocks traffic. I said, okay, but now explain to me technically how a firewall works. What is it actually doing? And unless you can explain to me and talk to me about the OSI layers and understanding what a port is and what protocols are and what layers they are, I said, if you don't understand that at a fundamental level, you're not going to be useful to an organization other than just saying, I need a firewall, because you don't understand how it works. That's what I would tell people is become a technologist at first, then understand security. Don't just jump into security. The number one piece of advice I give people is approach a problem like an offensive actor. What if I was someone trying to do something bad? What would I do and how would I do it? Would I try to bring down an organization from a disruptive standpoint? Am I trying to steal intellectual property? Am I trying to steal money? And how would I do it? And by thinking through that lens, it's much easier to start standing up different types of controls. Too many times security folks will just start with the answer. I want to put up data loss prevention. I want to put up CASB. I want to put up this. I want to put up this. But you have to take a step back and say, why am I doing these things? Because I'm trying to protect against what? These types of attack vectors.
You see a lot of excitement. You see a lot of people, especially really started during COVID, around trading different meme coins, getting into crypto, and they're controlling their MetaMask and potentially getting exposed to Ledger Connect. But they're being exposed to a lot of the technology. And we honestly think we've talked about how do you capture all of this resources and knowledge of these young kids that have been interacting with crypto and blockchain and turning it into something useful. And I think a lot of them could actually, if put in front of the right resources and training, been like, okay, great. You understand how to trade meme coins. A lot of the alpha's gone because the market's matured. So at least use that knowledge towards, say, protecting and securing and auditing and doing pen tests on real blockchains in the future. And I think that's an untapped resource that we should be focused on education wise.
Yeah, 100%. And a lot of it comes down to just use it, right? Like, there's a theoretical side of learning and then there's the practical side of learning. Like you can read as many books and white papers and as you want, but until you load that ledger, do some swaps and actually dive into DeFi and really truly understand what you're doing and lose money. There's a lot of very large companies that I know that when they were building their custody solutions or they're building this, they lost seed praises and they lost money while they were building it. And it was like learning pains of this is how I lost it. Now they can think through how can I build something in order to protect it. And the same thing goes with security. Until you get rug pulled, until you get drained from your crypto and realize what actually just happened is how you're going to learn. And the last piece of advice on that is reach out to the community. Web3 and crypto is one of the most open, welcoming communities that I've ever worked in. And you could reach, especially if you're just under the guise of, I want to learn from somebody. You reach out to 10 people. I would bet you 9 out of those 10 people would love to take a 15, 30-minute call with that individual and just walk them through their experiences, their journey, how they got into crypto, give them some resources. Now, listen, I get pitched all the time from vendors. Those I generally don't answer. But if I get a ping from a student that says, I'm just entering into this world and I'd love to spend 30 minutes with you, I will take that call 100% of the time.
Or a podcast that invites you on.
Yeah, listen, like my goal is I want to help people and I want somebody to come away from this podcast going, I never thought about it that way. I'm going to go do something better because it's all iterative. What we do today is not good for tomorrow because the bad guys know all of our controls and know all of our defenses. So whatever we did today, they're now trying to work around it tomorrow. So we have to get better tomorrow. So that's what this community is.
I was going to wrap it up there, but I was debating if I should ask this question, but you brought that up. So the bad guy, I'm thinking of Catch Me If You Can. Like they eventually hired him because he knew what to do. they hired him. So does that happen a lot in this industry in security where potentially old hackers that finally are like, all right, I'm done being nefarious. I want to jump to the good side. Does that happen a lot in just the overall market or not really because you can't
Not,
trust them down the road?
not really. What I could tell you is it's the same individuals, the same core. They just have, it's like the personalities are the same. They just choose to use their power for good in some respect. Like I've seen and I've worked with hackers that will find a vulnerability and are terrified and want to disclose it because they want it fixed. Now that same individual can say, I can go exploit this and steal $100 million. Like they're holding, and I've seen it. I've seen them say, this is a 0 day. This hasn't been announced to the world yet. And this is where it could be used negatively. And we will, some of them have been discovered by Halborn, and we'll work with those projects to say, we're going to help you fix it. Now that individual engineer or engineers within Halborn, obviously if they were the nefarious kind, they could use that for bad. So I don't see a lot of switching, but it is definitely the same type of individual. They just have a good moral compass and really want to leave this world in a better place.
All right. So the last question, just to wrap things up, would be like, what are some of the biggest misconceptions of blockchain? And ultimately, where do you see the space going to be in 5 years from now?
I think that the biggest, misconception is that it's insecure, right? I think it's not a matter of like inherently these things are insecure and it's not to be trusted. I think it just needs, I just think it needs maturity. I think we're gaining that maturity like this. The ecosystem today compared to where it was 2 or 3 years ago is worlds apart. We're getting enterprise level tools. We're getting enterprise monitoring tools. We're becoming a lot more knowledgeable in how to code certain things to avoid vulnerabilities and creating secure SDLC processes. I don't think it's a matter of yes or no. I think it's a matter of just a comfortableness with the technology and where we're going to start using it internally. So I don't think it's a matter of, like I said, like a binary yes or no decision. I think it's more of a risk-based approach where I think we're at this level of maturity. So I think we're good to use it here. But I think ultimately, whether it's 3, 5, 6 years from now, 7 years from now, I think that this will replace a lot of our existing market infrastructure. Again, it might just be the plumbing and people may not realize it, but it might all be digital ledger technology, like cross-border payment. You might get that little paper money on both sides, but that entire transfer process might have just been done in crypto.
Yeah, I'm excited to see and see if there's going to be multiple companies going public. Obviously, we know Coinbase, back. There's a few that are out there today, but I always almost make the analogy of the pets.com of the world. Those are gone. Some of the meme coins probably will be gone, but there's the Amazons, the Googles, all these big companies that also spurned out of that. And I think we're in, I don't know if the first inning, but maybe the second inning here overall. Thanks so much. I know you got to hop on another call. Really appreciate you coming on the Blockfield podcast and hope to see you around New York.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.